The rain poured down heavily that night, drumming against the small house where a boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His body ached from the long hours of work he had done earlier in the day. His hands were rough, his clothes worn out, and his stomach empty, but his heart burned with something stronger than hunger: hope. He had heard people say it 100 times. A boy like him would never amount to anything. He had no father, his mother struggled to put food on the table, and school was a distant dream. But deep inside, he refused to accept that this was all life had for him. He clenched his fists and made a silent promise to himself. He would not let his circumstances decide his future. Mornings were the hardest. He would wake up before sunrise, not to go to school like other children, but to help his mother with whatever work she could find. Some days, they sold vegetables at the market, standing for hours under the scorching sun. Other days, he ran errands for shopkeepers, earning just enough to buy a small meal. At night, when the streets emptied and the world grew quiet, he found a broken notebook in the trash. He wiped off the dirt and held it like a treasure. With a pencil stub, he began to teach himself to write. He traced the letters he had once seen on a torn newspaper, whispering their sounds under his breath, again and again, until they made sense. People laughed when they saw him scribbling in that tattered notebook. "What's the point?" they asked. "You will never escape this life." The word stung, but he held onto his dream like a drowning man clings to a piece of wood. He found old books in garbage bins, flipping through their pages under the dim light of a street lamp. He listened outside classroom windows, memorizing lessons as best as he could. And when exhaustion threatened to pull him down, he reminded himself of one thing: he was more than what the world believed him to be. One day, an old man in the market noticed him reading from a torn book while selling vegetables. The man watched in silence as the boy's lips moved, repeating words over and over. Then, with a knowing smile, he asked, "Do you like to learn?" The boy hesitated, afraid to answer. No one had ever asked him that before. But his heart spoke before his mind could stop him. "More than anything," he whispered. The old man nodded and returned the next day, handing him a book. "Come to my house when you're done working," he said. "I will teach you." The boy couldn't believe it. For the first time, someone saw his hunger not just for food but for knowledge. Every evening, after finishing his work, he ran to the old man's house, where he learned to read properly, solve math problems, and understand things he had only dreamed of knowing. Years passed, and the boy grew into a young man. He still worked hard, still struggled, but something was different now. He had knowledge. He saved every coin he could, sometimes going without food, just to afford a single school exam. And when he finally sat for that test, his heart pounded. He wasn't just writing answers. He was proving something to himself, to the world, to the voices that had told him he would never be more than a poor boy from the streets. When the results came, he held the paper in shaking hands. He had passed. Not just barely, but at the top of the class. Tears burned his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had won this battle, but there were more to fight. With his exam results, he knocked on doors, begged for scholarships, and never took no for an answer. He faced rejection after rejection, but he kept going. And then, one day, a door finally opened. A university accepted him. He stepped onto that campus with only a few coins in his pocket and an old bag slung over his shoulder. But in his heart, he carried something far more valuable, an unshakable belief in himself. The journey was still hard. There were days when he had no money for food, nights when he stayed awake worrying about how to afford the next semester. But he never stopped learning, never stopped pushing forward. Years later, the same people who had once doubted him now spoke his name with admiration. He had not only graduated but had achieved something greater than anyone had ever imagined. He had proven that no circumstance, no hardship, no voice of doubt could define him. He had rewritten his own story. And as he stood before a crowd, dressed in a suit he had once only seen from a distance, he looked out at the young children in the audience. Children who, like him, had been told they would never make it. With steady eyes and a voice full of certainty, he said, "You are more than your circumstances. Never stop believing in yourself." Because he knew, better than anyone, that even the smallest spark of hope, when protected and nurtured, could light up the darkest path.